Good day, all. This talk will examine the history of the press, or newspapers. In this and in my subsequent talks on the modern media, I shall begin with an international history and then look at Canada. My international history will focus primarily on Britain and the US. This is partly because these are the two countries that have had the most influence on Canada, but more importantly, as we shall see, these are the two countries in which the modern mass media were primarily invented. Newspapers first began to appear in Europe in the 17th century. Early papers had very small circulations, usually only around 100. They appeared irregularly, basically whenever the publisher felt like putting one out. They made no pretense at being objective. On the contrary, they explicitly put forward the views of the publisher, which most commonly consisted of personal attacks on public figures that the publisher happened to dislike. Since many of these attacks were on politicians, governments attempted to censor and regulate what was printed in the papers. The idea of a free press, meaning free of government censorship, only emerged gradually as Europe made the transition from monarchy to democracy. The press played a significant role in the creation of democracy. When Parliament was first founded, it consisted of factions of the aristocracy who didn't care what the public thought. When the capitalists replaced the aristocracy as the ruling class, these factions had to be transformed into political parties which could gain public support. The press was used to convey the political platforms of these parties to the general public and to gain their support. Monarchy doesn't need a press, because in monarchy there is no public debate. The people are just expected to obey their king. But democracy involves competition between individuals and political parties, so the public has to be made aware of who is running for office and what they have to say. This does not necessarily mean that the public has to be informed about the issues of the day, but it does mean that the media have to provide a forum for politicians to make speeches. By the 18th century, newspapers had expanded their circulations to around 1,000, but most of them were financially dependent on donations from politicians and political parties. This meant that these papers became in practice propaganda sheets for those politicians, drumming up support for them and attacking other politicians. This role meant that newspapermen were considered to be muckrakers and were looked down on by polite society, much as tabloid journalists still are today. Still, papers were written for the upper class and middle class, as they were the only ones who could read. The situation of the press changed in the 19th century because the 19th century saw a slow but steady expansion of education, which, by the end of the century, had resulted in the Western world attaining nearly universal literacy. Increasing the number of people who could read naturally increased the number of people who read newspapers. It became normal for papers to have a daily edition with a special edition on Sundays, as is often still the case today. By the end of the 19th century, some papers had a circulation of over 1 million. This is when we can speak of newspapers as becoming a true mass medium. In the US, working class literacy rose significantly in the early 19th century, which led to the publishing of the first newspapers written for a working class readership, the so-called penny press, which first appeared in 1833. At just 1 penny or 1 cent per issue, they were literally as cheap as possible, because they were intended for an audience that didn't have much money to spare. The penny press was not just cheaper than previous papers, it also provided a totally different kind of news. It created a division in the press that still exists to this day, that between the highbrow press and the lowbrow press. The highbrow press is the traditional political press, which is aimed at a middle-class and upper-class audience. The lowbrow press takes a more sensationalist approach to news and is aimed at a working-class audience. Instead of politics, it focuses on crime, human interest, and gossip, or what has been called sin, sex, and violence. These days, the tabloids are the lowbrow press. In the late 19th century, it was the so-called yellow journalism of Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. In case you're wondering, it was called yellow journalism not because it was considered cowardly or anything like that, but because both men's papers carried the Yellow Kid, which was one of the first ever newspaper comic strips about a kid in the slums of New York, and which was very popular in its day. Thanks to his endowment of the Pulitzer Prize, Pulitzer's name is now synonymous with excellence in journalism. But the journalism in his papers was of the most lowbrow, muckraking variety. Hearst used his papers to support his bid for political office, but failed. Hearst's life is presented in thinly fictionalized form in the famous movie Citizen Kane. The only part they got wrong was that Rosebud, the thing they spend the whole movie trying to figure out, was not the name of his sled. It was actually Hearst's pet name for his mistress's private parts. Not exactly the symbol of childhood innocence that the movie went for. One thing the movie got right was in showing that lowbrow publishers, who at first rejected politics because they were only interested in making money, became more interested in politics as they became rich newspaper barons. Let me quote you the words of Bruce Springsteen, who sang, "Poor man wanna be rich man wanna be king, and the king ain't satisfied until he rules everything." In other words, if you have nothing, the first thing you want is money. Once you have money, the next thing you want is power. This particularly applies to men more than women. And so in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American publishers developed political ambitions and re-established their connection with politics. On the lowbrow side, the 1920s saw the introduction of tabloids. However, in the Great Depression of the 30s, advertising revenue dried up and the tabloids died. They were reborn in the 70s, now imitating TV's style of news, with lots of pictures and short, snappy stories. This time, they stuck around, and by the 90s, they accounted for about 20% of North American newspaper circulation. In Britain, readership continued to expand through the 19th and early 20th centuries. By the beginning of World War II in 1939, the daily press had a combined circulation of over 10 million. However, this expansion was accompanied by a concentration of ownership. By 1939, half of Britain's papers were owned by just 3 men: Beaverbrook, Rothermere, and Kemsley. As their wealth and influence grew, so did their social standing. Beaverbrook and Rothermere both became government ministers, and both were eventually given titles: Lord Beaverbrook and Viscount Rothermere. The press continued to have a close relationship with politics and politicians. However, things changed after World War II. This was primarily due to the enormous growth in advertising. As corporations started to spend millions of dollars on newspaper ads, contributions from politicians became much less important. Publishers became more concerned with keeping advertisers happy than with keeping politicians happy. This made a change to the type of news being published. Even in the highbrow press, political news became less important and was written about less. Papers downplayed their political connection and became less partisan and more even-handed in their political articles. Since the end of World War II in 1945, the amount of space ordinarily devoted to politics in the papers has been roughly cut in half. Of course, if there's some sort of political crisis, then it makes the news. But such crises are usually relatively brief. Overall, compared to its origins, the late 20th century saw the press increasingly depoliticized. What replaced politics? Well, advertisers did not want papers full of boring political debates that only interested the middle and upper classes. They wanted news that was fun, light, and entertaining, so that ordinary working class people would buy the paper and see their ads. And so papers began to provide more human interest stories, more crime stories, sports, entertainment, fashion, and so on. These days, many people buy papers that support a different political party from themselves because they don't buy the paper for its politics. They buy it for its other content. I'm going to conclude my international history there because I'm going to look at more recent developments in the context of a history of the press in Canada, which we shall now go on to. It has become widely accepted that the Canadian press developed in 4 distinct historical stages or periods. With the dates rounded out, they are 1750 to 1800, the transplant period; 1800 to 1850, the partisan period or growth period; 1850 to 1900, the nation-building period or westward growth period; and from 1900 on, the modern period. I shall now go through each of these periods in turn. The printing press was brought to Canada by the British in 1750, and Canada's first newspaper was published in 1752. This was the Halifax Gazette, published in Halifax, Nova Scotia. However, the Gazette's circulation remained small, and at first, not many other papers were established. There were a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, much of Canada's population consisted of recent immigrants from Europe, especially Britain and France, And for a long time, many of them had the attitude that real news was what was happening back in Europe. So, most papers and other printed materials were imported from Britain and France because that's what people wanted to read. This is why this is called the transplant period, because Canadians mostly read printed materials transplanted from Europe instead of writing their own. Secondly, Canada was a colony of Britain, part of the British Empire. And in the colonies, no criticism of the British Crown or the British government was permitted. At a time when the European press was still heavily political, the Canadian press faced heavy censorship by the colonial government. Canadian publishers who voiced any sort of criticism of government policy could find themselves arrested, fined, imprisoned, and have their presses confiscated and their paper shut down. As a result, Canadian papers could do little but repeat official government pronouncements, which did not gain them many readers. With the press hamstrung, the first type of printed materials to gain widespread popularity in Canada was actually the almanac. Almanacs avoided censorship because they completely avoided politics, and instead provided a combination of practical advice and amusing or heartwarming anecdotes. Almanacs remained the most popular form of printed materials in Canada until the War of 1812. Although the historical periods I gave you are rounded out to the nearest 50, in practice the situation of the press only changed in 1812. After Britain and Canada won the War of 1812, defeating the US, Britain felt more secure in her rule over Canada and eased up on government censorship. As a result, papers rose in popularity and circulation. However, just as in Europe, these papers quickly became dependent on the financial support of politicians and political parties. This meant that, just as in Europe, each paper essentially became the mouthpiece for a particular politician or party. It was, in a word, a very partisan press. And this is why this is called the partisan period of the Canadian press. The coming of the telegraph in the 1840s and the railroads in the 1850s greatly speeded up the transmission of news and the distribution of newspapers. This was the time when Canada's papers became truly mass-market publications or mass media. The number of papers also grew swiftly. By 1850, Canada had almost 300 papers, although most of them were just weeklies. The 1870s saw the Industrial Revolution come to Canada. Industrialization led to urbanization, which promoted literacy and newspaper reading. In 1870, less than half of Canadian families bought a daily paper. By 1900, more papers were sold daily than there were Canadian families. In 1911, Canada hit an all-time high of 143 daily papers. The late 19th century is called the nation-building period because these nationwide publications helped to create a national culture and a national identity for Canada. This included promoting westward growth, particularly settlement of the prairies. The large increase in newspaper circulation attracted the attention of advertisers. And so advertising income came to outweigh political patronage much earlier in North America, including both Canada and the US, than in Europe. By 1850, ads took up between a third and two-thirds of newspaper space, and advertising income represented about two-thirds of the average paper's income. This has not changed greatly to this day. In Canada, as in the US, newspaper publishers became rich in the late 19th century and reconnected with politics in the early 20th century. Up to World War II, it became common for publishers to be appointed to the Senate in return for their political support. By the early 20th century, the mainstream press as we know it was firmly established, and we entered what's called the modern period of the Canadian press. However, the mainstream was challenged at first by alternative forms of press. The one I want to briefly look at is the radical press, established by the workers' movement in the first 20 years of the 20th century. This was a period of widespread labor unrest and strike action, primarily because the workers were trying to get trade unions legalized and the government was refusing to do so. All the mainstream press condemned the striking workers. They ran a series of articles glorifying leading businessmen as national heroes and urging the government to use all means necessary to stop the strikes, including force. The federal government complied. Between 1900 and 1913, 11 strikes were stopped by sending in the military, and the papers applauded every time. In the face of this universal hostility from the mainstream press, the workers decided that the only way to get their side of the story to the general public was to publish their own papers. These papers always had poor funding and low circulations, and they did not survive for very long. However, while they existed, they showed that a working-class press did not have to be a sensationalist press. The radical press provided news that directly affected the interests of the working class. They provided news on trade union organization and strikes. They wrote exposés of businesses that were treating their workers particularly badly. They wrote about the March of Labor and demanded a square deal for the workers. And they launched a series of crusades against specific injustices of capitalism. However, after the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919 was violently broken up by the military on Bloody Saturday, the workers' movement declined and the radical press died fairly swiftly. Despite this, the 1920s saw growing public demand that the press become less partisan and more fair and objective in its reporting. While most papers continued to support one particular political party, they stopped slavishly agreeing with everything that party did and began to occasionally criticize it. Some papers even switched their political allegiance. Then, after World War II, Canada saw the founding of its first schools of journalism. These schools wanted to see journalism established as a true profession, with journalists getting the respect due to professionals. In order to introduce professionalism into journalism, these schools set standards of reporting. Young journalists were taught to be fair and objective in their reporting. At first, publishers and editors were not keen on these new standards of objective reporting and were reluctant to hire journalism grads. But the labour market is primarily based on qualifications, and after a while editors started to expect these and hired more grads. By the mid-70s in Canada, a majority of working reporters were journalism school grads, and today over 90% are. The years after World War II not only saw an increase in education in general and journalism schools in particular, it also saw an increase in the legal rights of trade unions, which led to more workers forming trade unions, including journalists. The late 40s and 50s saw the unionization of journalists at most of Canada's major papers. This inevitably led to disputes between unions and editors. Most unions fight primarily for economic improvements for their members, better wages, benefits, vacation pay, and so on. Journalists' unions fought for all those things too, but in addition, they also got into disputes over the content of what journalists wrote. Journalists were being taught to report fairly and objectively, so that's what they wanted to do. But their editors were telling them that any article published in their papers had to be written from the viewpoint of big business and had to be favourable to big business. This ideological conflict peaked in the 1960s. The 60s saw North American culture in general, and student culture in particular, swing sharply to the left. When these left-wing students graduated and went to work for right-wing editors, disputes and even strikes broke out, with journalists wanting the freedom to write what they believed, not what their editors believed. This dispute was settled in the 70s by the establishment of the so-called Fairness Doctrine, which all major Canadian papers still abide by. The Fairness Doctrine states that, in order to present the news fairly, journalists must present both sides of any public issue or dispute, not just one side. This might sound like a victory for the journalists, but it's not that simple. In practice, the Fairness Doctrine often boils down to two-way mudslinging. The two sides throw accusations and counter-accusations back and forth at each other until the waters are so muddied that almost nobody can figure out what's really going on. That means nobody can act to change things, which suits the capitalists just fine. One example of this is the dispute between the environmental movement and resource extraction companies, especially big oil. The environmentalists have a small mountain of scientific facts which show that corporate industrial action is causing climate change and having many other harmful effects on the environment. But the corporations don't want to spend the money to clean up their act, so instead they hire mouthpieces to dispute the scientists' findings, to provide alternative and totally unscientific theories, and to generally throw out as much fake news as they can, so that then they can claim that there's a controversy or a disagreement among the experts, that nothing is certain yet, and therefore that we should change nothing and allow the corporations to go on doing whatever they want. In addition to the Fairness Doctrine, another more informal agreement was arrived at in the press. A. Kent McDougall has written that as a left-wing journalist, the only way he could get work in the mainstream press was by agreeing to write over 90% of his articles on right-wing themes. In exchange, he would be allowed to sneak in the occasional leftist article, although even those would almost always be edited and toned down. He said that he had to constantly argue with his editors to persuade them to allow him to write articles that were a bit different from their usual right-wing propaganda. In short, journalists get the occasional win as long as the editors win most of the time. Journalists have made a small dent in the wall of right-wing media ideology, but only a small one. The years after World War II also saw a major concentration of press ownership in Canada. More and more papers became owned by fewer and fewer people. The main reason for this was the coming of TV. I shall have more to say about TV in subsequent talks, but for now what matters is that TV news took away many newspaper readers. As a result, newspaper circulations have been falling ever since the early 50s. This decline in income put pressure on papers to amalgamate into large chains so as to survive financially. By the 1950s, a corporate oligopoly of just 4 families had come to dominate the Canadian press: Southam, Thomson, Sifton, and Irving. Since then, the names have changed, but the situation has remained the same. By 1960, those 4 families owned over a third of national newspaper circulation. By the late 80s, they owned almost 80%, with Southam and Thomson together owning over 60% of English language circulation. The 90s and 2000s then saw a fresh wave of corporate acquisitions and mergers. In 1990, just over 17% of Canada's daily newspapers were still independently owned. By 2010, only just over 5% was still independent. The other 95% now all belong to about a dozen corporate chains. Many of these acquisitions were organized by Conrad Black, who practically took over Canada's Anglophone press in the 1990s. His Hollinger Company took over Sifton's in 1995 and Southam's in 1996, giving it 42% of Canadian daily circulation, including Regina's Leader Post. Thomson's also sold off their papers in the mid-90s to be replaced by new corporations: Torstar, which publishes the Toronto Star, and Sun Media, which publishes the Toronto Sun, and Quebecor and Power Corporation in Quebec. Quebecor bought Sun Media in 1998, so by the late 90s, there were again 4 corporations which together owned almost 80% of daily newspaper circulation. Through the 1990s, Conrad Black was the most powerful man in the Canadian media, and in 1998 he founded the National Post, largely as a forum in which to express his own pro-business views. However, in 2001, he immigrated to England to become Baron Black of Cross Harbour, and in 2003 it was revealed that Black had been making illegal payments to himself as CEO of Hollinger's. He was forced to resign, was sued by Hollinger's for $425 million, and in 2007 was sentenced in the US to 6.5 years in prison for fraud and ordered to repay Hollinger's shareholders $30 million. He appealed, got his sentence reduced, and was released in 2012. He has been allowed back in Canada, but his application to regain his Canadian citizenship has so far been denied. Hollinger's declared bankruptcy after his conviction in 2007. Hollinger's former papers, including the National Post and the Leader Post, were bought in the year 2000 by CanWest Global Communications, owned by the Asper family, who briefly became the largest owners in the Canadian press. However, CanWest overextended itself with all this buying and was forced to declare bankruptcy in 2009. Its newspapers were sold to the newly formed Postmedia Network, Inc. in July 2010, and CanWest TV was sold to Shaw Media in October 2010. In 2015, Postmedia, under CEO Paul Godfrey, who used to run the Toronto Blue Jays, among other things, bought Sun Media from Quebecor, which has decided to concentrate on its francophone publications. This means that Postmedia is now the largest newspaper owner in Canada. As of 2015, Canada has 105 daily newspapers, 93 English, 11 French, and 1 Chinese. Of the English papers, Postmedia owns 47, Torstar owns 10, Quebec-based Transcontinental Media owns 11, In the Maritimes, which it bought from CanWest in 2002, and the remainder are mostly smaller local papers. Of the French papers, Power Corporation owns 7 and Quebecor 2. So in short, what this brief history shows us is that, over time, the names change, but the situation stays the same. 4 corporations dominated the Canadian press by the 1950s, and 4 corporations dominate the Canadian press today. The corporations change, but the corporate oligopoly remains. Moreover, in practice, oligopoly means monopoly. Because once you only have about half a dozen corporations dominating any sector of the economy, they always get together and engage in collusion, which means that they make backroom deals to carve up the market so that each of them has a monopoly in a particular area and they don't really compete. This is what has happened with Canada's newspaper industry. Each corporation operates in a different region and different cities. Now, it was not like this at first. Up to the early 20th century, each city had a number of different newspapers. In the 1900s, even Regina had 5 daily newspapers. But today, Regina, like all but Canada's largest cities, has just 1 daily paper. In the course of the 20th century, all small Canadian towns and cities became single paper monopolies, and large cities became virtual monopolies. The corporations say that this was due to free market competition, but in reality, it happened through collusion. For example, on August 27, 1980, Southam closed its Winnipeg paper, and Thomson closed its Ottawa paper and sold its Montreal and Vancouver holdings to Southam. So, in one day, press competition was effectively eliminated in those 4 cities. The federal government laid conspiracy charges, but since anti-monopoly legislation in Canada is very weak, the corporations were acquitted. Canada's largest cities do still have more than one paper each, but in practice there is no competition because the market has been divided up by language and by class. Montreal has both English and French papers, which obviously have different readerships, so they don't compete. The other half-dozen major cities have been divided up by class, based on the traditional highbrow, lowbrow distinction. At the top, you have Canada's only national papers, the Globe and Mail and the National Post, both of which are aimed at an upper-class audience, and so are highbrow papers which focus on politics and economics. Then you have the middlebrow papers that aim at a middle-class audience, such as the Toronto Star, Vancouver Star, Leader Post, and so on, that focus more on local community news. Then at the bottom you have the lowbrow, sensationalist tabloid papers aimed at the working class, such as the Sun chain, which began with the Toronto Sun in 1971 and spread to all major cities in the course of the 70s and early 80s. So, 3 different press corporations can publish in the same city without really competing because each is targeting a different readership: upper class, middle class, and working class. In the late 20th century, the general public became aware of this lack of competition, and as a result, public confidence in the press fell dramatically. People understand that if you have a monopoly, then you can write whatever you like, so what you write can't be trusted. In the early 80s, a royal commission, the Kent Commission, was established to investigate the situation of the Canadian press. It found that less than 1 in 4 Canadians believed that the press was fair and unbiased, and that the majority of Canadians placed more faith in TV news. The Kent Commission made a variety of recommendations on how to restore the press's credibility by reintroducing competition, but as with most Royal Commission recommendations, these were completely ignored by the government. Instead, in the 21st century, the government has allowed concentration of press ownership to reach unprecedented levels. The Federal Competition Bureau had no problem with Postmedia's takeover of Sun Media, even though it meant that Postmedia now owns over 50% of English daily papers and over 60% of total daily circulation in Canada. This virtual monopoly has continued to undermine the legitimacy of the press. Recent polls have found that about half of Canadians question the accuracy and truth of the information provided by the press. Each Western country's press is a corporate oligopoly, just like Canada's, which means that each country's press is run by just a handful of rich men. Since they all know each other and move in the same social circles, it's easy for them to jointly establish a right-wing, pro-business culture in the newspaper industry as a whole. For example, when Conrad Black was the big man in the Canadian media, he explicitly said that he didn't see much point in owning newspapers if he couldn't use them to get his right-wing point of view across to the general public, so as to have influence on political and economic developments. And so Black founded the National Post and frequently wrote editorial columns for it and for his other newspapers expressing his views. However, that is relatively unusual these days. What's much more common is that whenever Black's corporate empire took over another paper or magazine, he would often fire some or all of the editorial staff on the grounds that they were too left-wing, and replace them with his own hand-picked editors who shared his right-wing views. These editors would then maintain a pro-business tone in their publications without Black having to be directly involved. The same thing has been done by Canada's other big media owners. For example, when Kenneth Thompson bought the Globe and Mail in 1980, he replaced much of the editorial staff to make it even more business-oriented. So, most owners now stay behind the scenes, but by picking the editors, they make sure that their publications put forward their views. All of these corporate oligopolies promote the same right-wing corporate agenda. So, while English speakers can now gain access to papers from all over Canada, the US, Britain, and elsewhere via the internet, this only provides the illusion of more choice because, with just a handful of exceptions, you're really getting the same news from all of them. Internationally, the Canadian press is dominated by the US press. First of all, the American press is, of course, much bigger. Canada has just over 100 daily newspapers. The US has over 1,800. Canadian law ensures that the Canadian press has remained Canadian-owned. However, in practice, this just means that Canadian news is written by Canadians. Because from the very beginnings of the newspaper boom in the 1870s, Canadian papers bought their international news from Associated Press in the US. This is because it was much cheaper than sending their own reporters all over the world. Today, Canadian papers buy over 95% of their foreign news from the US and run it without change. This means that on everything that happens outside Canada, we're basically getting America's view of the world. Of course, we're not the only ones. These days, US-based United Press International supplies over half of all the international news published in the entire world. I shall finish up by briefly looking at how the internet is affecting the press and how it may affect it further in the future. Like all media, the press has had to adapt to the rise of the internet. The internet provides the press both with new opportunities and with new competition. Online editions attract the younger generation and increase circulation. On the other hand, you no longer have to read your local paper. You can subscribe to practically any major newspaper in the world. In theory, this means that the internet increases competition, increases consumer choice, and increases diversity of opinion. In practice, however, this is debatable. Most people are interested in local news above all, so they continue to buy their one and only local paper rather than one from halfway around the world, which means that in practice, there is still a press monopoly. Postmedia and other Canadian publishers are trying to make their newspapers more profitable by introducing a new focus on promoting online readership. In 2022, 8 major newspapers stopped printing Monday editions in order to cut costs and urge their readers to turn to their online editions. As I said before, the press's biggest problem is that newspaper readership has been declining ever since the advent of TV and TV news in the 50s, and this has only been exacerbated by the coming of the internet. The internet has become the place where Canadians get most of their news. By 1988, only about 54% of Canadian adults read a paper daily, and by 2008, that was down to 48%, less than half. However, while readership of paper newspapers has continued to decline, this has been partly offset in the 21st century by a swift growth in online readership. By 2015, more than 1 in 4 of all newspaper readers in Canada were digital readers. Most of those young adults in the 18 to 34 age bracket. As a result, overall newspaper circulation in Canada roughly held steady at about 5.5 million daily through the 2010s. However, the coming of COVID prompted many people to cancel their newspapers and instead get their news from online sources like Facebook. As a result, from 2018 to 2020, the operating revenue of Canadian newspaper publishers fell by over 20% to just $2.1 billion. With advertising revenue increasingly switching over to the internet, newspaper revenue has been declining, and many smaller community and ethnic papers are being forced to shut down. However, some financial help is on the way. Australia recently passed legislation forcing big online companies like Google and Facebook to pay compensation to news businesses when they make news content available online. And similar legislation has been proposed in both Canada and the US. However, for the press to adapt to the coming of the internet may mean much more than just putting out an online edition and getting financial compensation. The corporate press has traditionally presented a unanimous front, but the internet provides diversity of opinion. A bland, old-fashioned, politically correct stance, supposedly impartial but in practice right-wing, may hold little appeal for the current internet generation. Old fogies like myself continue to read newspapers because that's how we were raised. But today's young adults have no such sentimental attachment to the press. On the contrary, they laugh at the very idea of paying for information which is available for free from a variety of other sources. To survive, newspapers may have to distinguish themselves from the herd. They may have to provide material which cannot be gained elsewhere, such as specific opinions and positions on the issues that make the news. An online newspaper is in practice just another blog. And bloggers gain a following not by being bland, but by being opinionated. The press may have to abandon its pretense at an objectivity that most people no longer believe in, and instead take an explicit stand on the issues it reports on. Taking a stand will, of course, alienate some readers, but it will attract others. Standing for nothing attracts nobody. Creating a more diverse and openly opinionated press would bring us full circle. This is how newspapers began before they became corporations. As the internet has introduced more diversity of opinion into public debate, it may also force the press to become more diverse and less monolithic just to survive. We shall see. That concludes what I have to say on the history of the press. A transcript of this talk is available if you're interested. Good day.